This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This series of videos is going to be considering the world of the New Testament. And this is to talk about the larger world in which the New Testament is found. And the goal of this video series is to give you some pertinent information that will help you when you go read the New Testament to be able to find some of the cultural context behind it to illuminate reading. And so today we have an overview. And I'm just going to bring up a few things about the Roman world and the Jewish world that are meant as specifically illuminating for the New Testament. There's a lot more in both of these worlds than we could possibly do in one short video or even a video series. But what this is about is the specific things that we find in or that will dialogue with the New Testament. So that's what we're going to be considering. And they won't always be a comparison as one or the other, but instead several topics, some of which will be comparative. So the first thing I want to mention is in the Roman world, we'll do that one first, is about religion. Because religion is very distinct as to what this is and to what it is not in the Roman world. That is, religion is built around, if I can draw here, temples. And the temple is where one provides sacrifice or offering. And when you make these sacrifices or offering, you go to one of the gods, and notice gods plural, and it is what is often described in Latin as a do ut des relationship. I act with the result that you would act. So the idea is that I, the worshiper, go sacrifice at a temple of a particular god, and then that god will do something on my behalf. I've acted, and so the god will now act. They also thought of gods in terms of function, meaning if you needed a particular thing done, you went to the god that handled that particular thing. If there were new things and more things, you would expect more gods. It's a polytheistic world. And one key component here is that religion was not about ethics, how you should behave toward other people. It simply was not part of religion. They did care about that. They cared very deeply about that, but it was called philosophy. Next, I'd like to consider more generally, very helpful for the study of the New Testament, is simply society. Religion's actually the easiest thing to understand. The hardest thing is to understand the world that they live in. And society has a few different angles, but one thing I want to mention is the patronage system. And the patronage system is that they had a radically hierarchical society. So I'm going to build this on the grand scale, but it would also be just as true in a family structure, so that you have one figure at the top. So in the large scale, this is the emperor. In the more local scale, it would be the paterfamilias, the leader of the family. Then under it, there are classes. There is the nobility. This is where you have your senatorial class, others of note, your generals. Then you have your citizens, and this is meant to be a pyramid here, so these get a little bit wider every time. And then underneath the citizens, you have effective slaves, meaning they're not actually slaves, but because of the way in which society structures, they are basically enslaved. And then you have actual slaves. And you see this is meant to be a pyramid. These get larger the larger you are. You'll notice what you're kind of lacking is what we would call a middle class. Citizens were not necessarily well off. They could be deeply impoverished. And so what you really have is you have a very, very small number of people withholding almost all of the wealth and power. And so the society is completely built on this. There is no police force. There is no fire department. There is no general social structures we have. So how do you have any structure or order? Well, it was because of this structure. If you were down in this area and had almost no ability to protect yourself, you knew someone who did. And this system was built so that benefaction, or the word gratus, went down, and those at the top or above you would give you the things you needed for living, and in response, you provided gratus to them, which is thanks. And so giving thanks was not something that was a spontaneous thing, but an expected thing. If you did not do this, they would not help you, and there was societal and indeed legal punishment for not giving proper thanks. And it might even lead all the way to the emperor of worship. That is, you will provide loyalty. You will be their loyal subjects. And you see, it's not chosen. Look at here again, these groups here, effective and actual slaves. And to understand how this structure was built around it, up to 90% of society were these two categories. And so you have a radically hierarchical structure where you need to know and be empowered by those who are important, and those who are important only do this for your own benefit so that you will be loyal to them. It was an effective system. It also was a very punitive system, and it was very hard for most people. It also is important to point out that justice, and I'll use a slightly different color, justice was structured in two categories. One was civil justice and one was criminal, similar to what we do in our society. But what was different is that the civil justice is actually what American justice is built on, is a similar idea, trial by jury, but criminal justice was not. It was trial by magistrate and no jury. And criminal justice was the magistrate would simply make a judgment about how they felt something should be done, and there was no expectation that that judgment would be precedent for anything else. It was the whim of that particular magistrate. There was no sense there had to be continuity or consistency, so you never knew what you were going to get. It also was entirely suit-driven, meaning someone had to haul another person into court. That's how we do our civil law, but not how we do our criminal law. But for them, it was both. That if someone committed a crime, it was up to someone else to sue them, even if it was criminal structure. Again, you needed this. Those who'd been a crime perpetrated them at the bottom needed to call on those who had the ability to bring suit, because they couldn't do it themselves. I also want to mention that in the Roman world, how they gathered, because this is very important for the New Testament. They gathered around food at the meal, but they did not gather in public meetings. Some of you may have traveled and may have seen some of the amazing Greek theaters that where there was all this Greek drama that was being presented. And you might have visited the one in Ephesus, for example, which is incredibly well maintained. Or you might know some Greek dramatists, such as and playwrights, such as, say, Aristophanes or Aeschylus, or these different figures. You'll notice you don't know those for the Roman world. In fact, you don't know any plays of the Roman world. You know, Greek plays about the Roman world sometimes. Well, they didn't really want people to go to the theater, because if they went to the theater, they might have meetings. And if they have meetings, they might be conspiring against the Roman Empire. And you might say that sounds harsh, but that's how they managed it. So instead you had private gatherings around dinner. And dinner becomes one of the most important social dynamics. Dining together, eating together is one of the most important things one can do in this society. Finally, just to mention literacy and orality. That is to say, everybody knows that only about 5% of the people could read. But it's harder to imagine a world where you didn't need to read, because it wasn't a literate culture the way our culture is literate. That is, there were people who could read, but it wasn't an important skill. In fact, some slaves were the ones who read, and the people up above would not bother to learn such a rude skill. Instead, have that as a task that others need to do. Totally different. And it's because their society was an oral society, not based on writing, but instead on speech. And it turns out speech is incredibly important, and you could have people who were dialoguing carefully with texts through words, to the point that you would rather call them pretty literate, even though they didn't know actually how to read or write themselves. Okay, this gives just a few things about the Roman world, and I just want to mention a couple about the Jewish world. Some are similar. For example, literacy and orality is the same thing. But a few points that are really important for the New Testament. So the obvious distinction here is in religion. Unlike their polytheistic world, there is one temple and, of course, one God. However, this is in tension, because there's one temple in Jerusalem, and yet there's an issue called the diaspora. And this has to do with, in 586 BC, they were driven from the land out into Babylon. And in 539 BC, they were allowed to return. That is, the people of Israel. However, most people did not return. And so they live in you see that, our English word dispersion, which comes from that, the diaspora all over the Roman Empire, and indeed beyond the Roman Empire. Well, this becomes a problem, because they have but one temple. And here you had a whole bunch of temples, not just many gods, but each god had many, many temples. You could have a temple everywhere. Well, there was no other way. It was only one temple. And that temple was built again on sacrifice. But what happens if you don't live there? How can you offer a sacrifice? And that tension kind of governs this, what we call Second Temple period, meaning when they came back, they rebuilt the temple. So we call it the Second Temple period. Because in the New Testament, that Second Temple had not yet been destroyed. It would get destroyed in the year 70 AD. But the solution to this tension before this, when Jesus is alive, is what we call Torah. Torah, of course, is not a new concept in the slightest. It is sometimes the written Torah is called the first 5 books of the Bible. But then there is the larger concept of Torah, which is there is God, there is Israel, and anything that relates those two things is Torah. And the scroll becomes one of the most important aspects of the life of what it means to be Jewish. And the gathering space is not the temple, but instead is the rise of the synagogue, which just means gathering together. And when they gather together, where do they gather together? Where is the synagogue? All over. There's one temple, but often the diaspora, they could have a distinct gathering space where they practiced and studied Torah. There's a lot more to talk about with that. Of course, it's a very huge topic. One major difference is here, ethics was not part of religion. Here it absolutely is. And so that you have that universality of religiosity to cover all things. The other thing that is built into that is that there is a distinct identity to being Israel. In fact, at this time period, one scholar, Shia Cohen, calls it the beginning of Jewishness. What did it mean to be part of this group? What did this mean to be someone following Torah? Was it a pure religious thing? Is it what we would call a racial or ethnic thing? Is it something that's in between? Is it about citizenship of Israel, either citizenship that you're enacted, meaning you actually live there, or citizenship that's yours that you could enact if you returned, if you're in the diaspora? See, all of those questions are coming up right at this time period when Jesus is alive. And then the last thing I want to mention here is the governance structure, because it's quite confusing. That is to say that during the time of Jesus, that Judea is a Roman territory, meaning it's not an independent land, but it's also not a province. So they don't have a governor at this time. What they have is a prefect, a Roman prefect, which many of you know from the figure Pontius Pilate, who is a Roman official who handles those issues related to Rome, which, by the way, were taxes and security. And then there was the local Jewish authorities, such as the Sanhedrin or the Herods, who could handle issues that they didn't care anything about. So this is a very diverse time with a lot of things happening, a lot of back and forth. And in this video series, we'll be looking at many of these things in more detail to get a better picture of what's happening within the world of the New Testament. Watch for those videos in the coming weeks.